Okay, welcome back, everyone. We'll get started on the last couple of agenda items. And it looks like agenda item number 7 is discussion of proposed Ripple Board 2020 annual report contents. And Kelsey, is somebody kicking that off from DOJ?
Sure, I'm happy to. I've distributed, and there's some copies at the front for the members of the public. I have distributed a copy of a draft outline for this year's report, and I just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page, that we could go through it together. I'm looking for my copy. Sorry. So you can see that we just did a overall go through of the similar layout as we have done in the past few reports, where we do different chapters, different sections based on subcommittee groups. Not sure if we want to continue with this or change the kind of layout. Of course, this year's report is going to be heavily based on, reliant on the analysis itself. But we want to also make sure that that is not the only, we want to make sure that this analysis has enough context and, that it's based in the reality of what this data is saying. And so I want to make sure that our proposed contents do get at that contextual information. So at the moment we have, an executive summary, and then we'll go through an introduction, which can go through, as we talked about before, just doing a reintroduction of what the board's charge is, to make sure that this is a standalone report, that everyone who's reading it knows what we're intended to do, where we came from, and then it would do an overview of the work completed since the 2019 report, which of course is a review of all of our meetings, all of our public engagement, the submission of the first 6 months of data, and all of the a quick review of the what was included a lot in the last year's report, the 2019 report, where we look through the different ways that data integrity was ensured, the trainings, all that sort of thing, and then what we've done to prepare for the Wave 2 data collection, and then including the purpose and intent of the year's report of this coming the 2020 report, and providing a basis for what this analysis is intended to do, and what went into making sure that the public reading the report understands that we've had these open dialogues, these discussions. We aren't just doing it in a vacuum. We've talked to all the stakeholders and have reviewed the best analytical techniques to get at this. And then I think we were planning on starting with that stop data analysis, which it depends. As Kevin said, we're just starting to get into it, but I think a lot of that will depend on the layout of this section. Will depend on kind of what the research center and others have determined is the best way to approach it. But we definitely want to make sure, as I said, that this section is heavily embedded with contextual information. So making sure that we do the review of the data integrity protocols that are maintained, the overview of the outreach and research conducted to inform this analysis. It's not just the data, the numbers by themselves. And we hopefully will have visualizations that go along with this data. That's our hope, because we want to make sure that every type of learner is covered, and that this information is widely disseminated. And then we have a section for what we're suggesting for, and has been brought up by the policies subcommittee as a potential for their work in this year's report, is a review of just the bias-free policing policies to go along with this data, the analysis of the first 6 months of data, the first year of data. So we would keep it small to just the first wave agencies, and looking at their policies of just the bias-free policing policy, rather than the policies that might relate to bias-free policing, such as supervisory review, body-worn cameras. We would keep it just to that, and look at pros and cons of what we see, and then potentially add model policy language to kind of build on what we had included in last year's report, which is the best practices, take it one step further and say, okay, now we've reviewed those policies for the first wave agencies, that here is their data, here is our understanding of their, we did an overview of their policies, here's some model policy language we see from that. Before I continue, we can also, I know I'm spewing a lot of information at you, if we wanted to get some feedback on what we thought about that so far.
I just had a couple questions. I mean, obviously, the thing I'm interested in is 3E, the analysis of rate one-stop data. So hopefully that will be interesting and deep. 2 questions. One, I think it's great that there's now this data research center capacity, but my understanding is that there was going to be an outside contract to an academic institution or other researchers, so I wanted to see where that is. And then I just sort of had a question, I think, for you, Dave, or others in law enforcement, from where you sit. And I know you're not a Wave 1 agency, but do you anticipate that sitting on top of an agency that you may do your own internal analyses, because this will all be data that I assume you didn't otherwise have? Have you thought about how you might do that internally, and then sort of for the board, whether if there are agencies that are doing that, not necessarily sharing that analysis, but that may also lead to some best practices, right? Because let's say you find that 4 of your officers are responsible for 90% of whatever problem may arise.
Yeah, I definitely see each agency taking an individual look at it, you know, whether they do something internally or hire, you know, a company. You know, one of the challenges that we've all discussed as the board, though, is there's no funding that's coming along with this to the agencies to do those kind of in-depth things. And so it's going to be unfortunate, but what I see initially is that there's going to be some challenges for some agencies to really take much of a look at it other than what they can do internally, until we really, you know, encourage the legislature to start passing along some funding to really take that next step to do something with the data. And so, but I think it's going to be huge for agencies to take a look at, and hopefully there'll be some, you know, hopefully academia that will help the agencies take a look at it, whether it's through some type of grant or things like that, so that way they can work together to try to get to the bottom of things, whether it's, you know, anomalies that pop up or issues that pop up, where they can take a look at, you know, some specific, you know, officers or deputies that might be involved. So I think it's going to be big, you know, when people start to really take a look at it. I don't foresee a lot of law enforcement agencies that aren't reporting yet taking a too in-depth look, but I definitely think as those agencies come on board, everyone's going to look at it.
I think that's important. I think we should take that up, or the policy committee or something, in terms of funding to enable that. But then back to the question of, you know, is there going to be an outside contract, and corollary to that, will this data be open source so that researchers can wrap their heads around it, even if they don't have state funding to do it?
Maybe Nancy or Kelsey, you guys have any inside information there?
Yes. So there has always been an opportunity to contract with an outside research body, and if that is something that the board wants, we can pursue that. Again, I think you recall we had tried to do that with Spark, which was the organization that Jennifer Eberhardt led. However, there were some technical contracting issues with our state contract that Stanford could not agree to, and unfortunately that process would have been arduous to try to get it's the entire state of California, it wasn't DOJ, to change its contract. It would be much easier, I'm told, to try to contract with a UC or a Cal State University or someone like that, and if that's something that the board would like us to pursue, we can take that on right away.
Yeah, I think that would be great, and I don't know if you need a formal motion and action from the board, but I don't know how others on the board feel. I appreciate the work that the research center is going to do, but I think that having an independent expert academic to take a look at this data, and especially somebody who has had the the experience of doing, these large-scale data analyses of police profiling or use of force would really enhance our ability as a board to fulfill our mission to understand and address racial and identity profiling.
Yeah, kind of corollary to what everybody said, but just one step further is like having resources available for those consultants or whomever to work directly with the agencies, not just develop the best practices. And one other thing I was thinking is the corollary that I've experienced was in working with school districts, a lot of them are implementing restorative justice practices to address racially disparate discipline practices, and we had like a number of foundations that were interested in funding those, so like a resource database for private foundations that might also be willing to fund some of this work, places that agencies could look to if finances are truly an issue.
And it's up to you whether you want to just ask us to pursue that or take a vote. And then I do know that through discussions I've had with some of the Wave 1 agencies, they are pursuing contracts either through funding through their own departments or pro bono contracts with professors to have data analyzed. And they are definitely looking into that. San Francisco Police Department is doing that. I was told by San Diego Police Department that they were also looking into that. I think LA Sheriff was also planning on doing that. So there are researchers around the country that just want to get their hands on your data.
Sure. And I think that's great, but I think the board itself
Sure. I'm
and the state.
talking about
yeah.
two separate things.
That's right,
Yes,
that's right.
two separate things.
So I would love to hear if anyone thinks differently. Otherwise, I would love to go ahead and make a motion that DOJ contracts with an academic expert to supplement the work that the research center is doing.
Ask a question, I understand several different reasons why that is beneficial. I'm not trying to say it's not beneficial. I'm just interested to hear, is it to supplement the work of the research center because we feel the research center doesn't have the capacity? Is it to provide an outside third-party review to add validity to the context? I'm just interested to hear some of the reasons why it's important to the board.
Yeah, so I think we are very fortunate in the state of California to have some really amazing academic experts who have already done great work on analyzing this kind of data. And I think bringing one of them or an institution on board to complement the work that the research center is doing would strengthen the analysis. It would also provide, an independent look at the data. And as we were just hearing, this research center is very new, right? Just begun in 2018. And so I think we could build some capacity in the research center at the same time that we're taking advantage of capacity we already have in the state of California to really get robust analysis that will help us going forward, help inform the decisions that we make. So this is not in any way a reflection on any shortcomings of the research center. I'm really excited that the research center exists, but I do recognize that it's a young research center, and we do have expertise that we can tap, and this has always been on something that we could ask for and has been on the table.
And I would
So let's do it.
I would actually suggest casting a wider net. There are terrific research centers here in California, but that you also might find that a national research center, I'm thinking just for example, the Center for Policing Equity run by Phil Goff, that's worked under contract for years under US DOJ contracts and worked deeply with many police departments. Because I'm not saying one versus the other, but I would explore that as well, because you may get some real bang for your buck contracting with an institution that has looked at similar sets of problems in other parts of the country and may be able to use that as context, may be able to provide more information about best practices and other things learned, and contextualize the data in terms of what's happened in other states. But not pushing for that, but just saying I wouldn't limit it to only California-based institutions if we can get better product from somebody else.
Kevin?
Yeah, so this is a good idea. Just so everyone knows, the Research Center has spoken to a number of individuals that are involved in researching racial profiling already in the field, and so this is kind of in line with things that we've already considered, and so we'd be happy to work with an outside research institution so that we can learn from there. Them already have previously done studies like this, and so we're open to that. We've already considered that and have begun making preparations in case that was something that everyone wanted to pursue as well. So we're open to that.
Very good. We have a motion and a second. Any additional discussion? Okay, we'll just call for the vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, thank you.
One thing I wanted to add too is in terms of what some of the agencies were saying, that some agencies are taking it upon themselves to do their own independent contracts. I think that would be really important fodder for like a survey where we can see which agencies are doing that, to report that on the board. I think that might increase public confidence to understand that this data is not just existing in a vacuum. These agencies are taking it upon themselves. I think that would go a long way in terms of developing developing public trust on the issue and in what we're doing as a board.
And just building off that, something that we had discussed in the past was doing a little bit of like a showcase of some agencies that have done successful partnerships with academic institutions to give other agencies ideas of what's possible to do. Just, you know, say this is the process that happened to get that, to reach out to that institution. This is what we gained from that partnership. Would potentially be a good addition for this report.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and I don't know that we get a formal motion on that, but I think it would be good to just include that even on an ongoing basis each year to see which agencies anticipate doing their own internal research or hire someone.
Yeah, maybe having them report to a subsequent meeting too.
And Sheriff, since you kind of brought it up about what we do on an ongoing basis, I know we have at least one new board member, and we're going to be having some additional board members. I just wanted to remind the board that there are pieces in the report that are statutorily mandated. And so some people say, well, why are we reviewing civilian complaints again? And that's because that is a piece that is statutorily mandated. And then this year, because we will have the data for the first time, there is a new piece that is statutorily mandated, and that each report shall now include disaggregated statistical data for each reporting law enforcement agency. And this is found in the penal code. And it's, again, any of you are particularly interested, it is a crazy penal code section. It is 13519.4 J
3E.
E
It's
J3E.
Yeah, and it's listed
Yeah.
underneath the appendix in the draft.
Yes.
For
Oh,
2020. It's
yes.
at the very bottom of the second page.
Yes, I actually wrote that in the draft outline and forgot, but thank you. I could have found it much easier there. And so that is going to be an additional piece that's going to be needed for this year's report.
Will the research center be able to do runs, so, you know, as Sheriff Robinson was talking about, you know, where you have smaller mid-sized agencies that probably don't have the resources to go contract with a big academic institution, may not even have one with that capacity in their area. You know, I know people ask for data all the time from DOJ. Will the research center be able to be responsive to that? So if Dave has a bunch of questions he wants, you've already got the data, you can do the runs for him.
So if you're talking about like going to an agency and doing agency-specific analyses and building studies specific to a certain locale, the research center, I mean, you saw our staffing here, we have 4 people, and there's 400 and some odd agencies in the state of California, most of which are fairly small. So unless we were to increase in size by a large margin, I don't imagine that specifically going and having the research center contract with agencies and provide them with agency-specific services where we go on and address specific questions that each agency might have about their data is something that we have the capacity to do. Now that's not to say that we don't want to explore, and this came up at the subcommittee meeting that was held on February 5th, other options. It was referred to as economy of scale, right? The department has data for the whole state eventually. It's only 8 or something like that, 11, something like that agencies currently. But eventually we want to be able to build some tools so that agencies that might not have the capacity or dedicated staff or have the funds to contract with a university researcher can still go online and look at their information and run some form analyses that are something that a lay person could actually do and go through a guided maybe tutorial on something. So our idea is to eventually hopefully have that by the time that we get around to having those smaller agencies come on so that they're not completely at a loss. But with our current staffing levels, I don't think that we can say with any reasonable degree of confidence that we'll be able to respond to every single individual inquiry that we get from agencies, just because we are
So
such a
that
small
might be
unit.
another reason for us to advocate for sufficient funding for the outside contractor, because they might be able to provide that. Last question for you, Kevin. Then, do you anticipate that the analyses that the center is going to do will be agency-specific and comparative across one agency compared to another?
So the analyses that we plan on running one on the full set of the data, right? All 8 agencies that submitted. And then also by agency, so that if we run something on one agency, we can also run a similar analysis or the same analysis against another agency's data while excluding the rest of the agency's data, so that you could then see what this analysis looks like for San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office, what it looks like for LA County Sheriff's Department, LAPD, etc. for the first year of data. And so in that way, we'll have a set of analyses that are uniform across agencies, and then you don't run into issues if we ran something different for one agency but not the other. So that's the idea, to have both state level and then agency specific.
Right.
How that looks in future years when there's 400 some odd agencies and how we squeeze that into the Ripple Board's report is yet to be determined, but we would like to include some level of specificity that is at an agency level.
But so citizens of one jurisdiction would be able to compare how well their department is doing to departments in other parts of the state or multiple departments within their county?
I'm not sure if we can say that if someone's numbers in one county look different than someone in another's county, because there's other contextual factors that may come into effect. But what they will be able to know is that the analysis that produced the numbers that end up in the report is uniform across agencies. So if proportions of stopped individuals are different between one county and another county, or one jurisdiction and another jurisdiction, that doesn't necessarily, that can't be explained away by something that's occurring specifically within that agency, that's specific to that agency. But you could see that, X proportion is in this county, and this county over here has a different proportion of stops that have whatever outcome that we're looking at. So the method will be uniform across agencies, but being able to say that you can just compare one agency to another based on a single statistic is something that I consider looking into more, because I don't think that it's always going to be the case that you can do that.
No, I think people would want to be able to compare across agencies, across many different data points.
Correct. And so when we provide our analyses in the report, there'll be a whole bunch of different analyses that we perform for each of the agencies, and you can look at each of the analyses that we perform for each of the agencies. But maybe I'm misunderstanding your question a little bit. We are going to be doing all of the analyses for all of the agencies.
Okay, and that'll be published, so everybody will be able to see that?
Correct. Okay.
So are you saying that we'll be able to compare, it's just going to be maybe hard to draw conclusions based on the differences, because of, you would need to have a deeper analysis of each, what maybe differences in from one law enforcement agency to another?
Right.
Well, I think to get deep, right, and we may not be able to do this year with this initial set of data, but I would think you'd want to and maybe this again goes to the idea of another contractor as opposed to DOJ, if it makes more sense, if you guys are churning the actual numbers, and then others are looking at context, and over time, right, you would want to be able to see, okay, well, Dave put these different policies in place, or supervisory review or whatnot, and that resulted in X, right? So it's both across departments, but then I would think as a citizen, I would be very interested in what my department is doing and what result that's having to making things better or worse when it comes to profiling.
Right, and so that's harkens back to a point that I made earlier about the discussion that occurred on the 5th, and one of the questions that I brought up that came out of that meeting, in that your changes in policies, procedures result in the way that each agency's data looks, and that'll be something that we can look at over time. Right now we just have 6 months of data, and we don't have information on what policies would have changed, what we would expect to see from that data, but moving forward, that's something that it would be smart to look at and that we intend to in the future.
Very good. Thanks, Kevin.
I have a question going back to an earlier question that was asked about what law enforcement agencies would do with the data. Would we look at it in advance or use it internally? And I know as a chief, I would want to have that information. So it got me thinking, because I don't understand enough about the DOJ website and the access. Once if an agency uses the DOJ tools to submit their stop data, is that data now sent to DOJ and no longer accessible by the agency? Or is it, can the agency go back in and look at that data after it's been sent? It can, okay, great, so it's, sorry, I'll take this direction here. Ask some questions.
The answer is yes.
Okay, so then, if an agency wanted to, Wave 4 agencies such as my own, if I wanted to start collecting data today, would I be able to use the DOJ tools to do that without uploading it to DOJ to get an earlier indication or understanding of what's happening in my community earlier than 3 years from now?
Are you talking about using the DOJ web application to collect data or uploading locally collected data to DOJ?
Using the DOJ application to collect data and keep it as for my own review at this point in time, because we're not required to submit it until 2022 or 2023.
We're basically open for business, so any agencies that want to start collecting early, that's actually ideal for us because we can start, onboarding them individually. We haven't really talked to agencies, so we have been contacted by a small handful that are exploring that option. We haven't discussed, though, whether or not that would just be for their own purpose, and it wouldn't, if they send us data in a formal fashion, it would become part of the repository, and then could be reported out on. So that's something that we might have to explore further if an agency just wanted to use the tool to start collecting the data almost in kind of like a test or pilot mode, and whether or not that would be included in analysis or the board's report or not.
Thank you.
One last question. I know DOJ decided on very strict officer anonymity for a variety of reasons, but if I were a sheriff or a police chief, will I be able to get, if I want that data back, as you were talking about, will I be able to pierce that and know officer-specific information and which officers in each report?
Yes. So agencies, regardless of if they're currently in Wave 1 and those in Wave 2 also, if they are required to send data, we're housing it in our repository. Even if they're using their own local system, they can log into our repository and run reports on it. And then all agencies have the ability to download their full data set from us, including the officer information.
And also, the DOJ does not receive direct officer information. We receive officer ID, so we do not know who the officer is, but we know, their ID number, so we can identify them. So the DOJ will never have the officer's identification.
But a police chief would get it.
A chief should have that info. Yes, they are creating basically what do we call that? I can't remember. We had a name, but it's like a mask of sorts, so that information isn't translated to the DOJ. But each agency can look and know who is doing what, and then be able to run their reports And we encourage that, we encourage supervisory review, we encourage, agencies to look at trends over divisions and officer level. So they do have that capability.
Is the research center going to expand over the years as we get more and more data? Are we going to see increased staffing, do we think? Is that something that we should be asking the legislature for formally as a board or anything like that?
The answer is yes.
That's good.
Yes. I don't know if the board needs to ask for that information, but as things heat up, we can always, we're trying to beef up the research centers. Yeah.
I have a question. I know I haven't been here, so I just need to understand this. Are agencies able to adjust the data before submitting it?
Not adjust the data, but they're able to look at for errors that may have occurred in there and fix any errors that have occurred. So they have a supervisor review, but then once it actually gets inputted, then they can't no longer make any kind of changes to it.
So they do have, the first set is them looking at it and reviewing it and seeing the statistics, then,
My understanding is the individual entry, not necessarily overall numbers, just individual entry, but I'm not entering yet, so.
And I think Aaron can speak to this as well, but there are certain aspects of the data that can never be changed once the officer inputs it. But for example, if an officer inadvertently put somebody's name or driver's license in one of the open narrative fields, we basically are requiring them to redact or remove that information at the supervisory review level before they send it to the Department of Justice, because that's information that should never have been put in that stop record in the first place, because it violates that person's privacy. And this is not unlike police reports that are reviewed by supervisors before they are finalized.
Can I just ask what the data points are that the supervisors can review and what are the ones that can be touched? Because I know we touched on this on a previous meeting, but I don't think we went down with the data.
So I can speak to the DOJ application, and then there's some variations if agencies are using their own local systems. So they may have slightly different rules. But for the DOJ application, any of the perception-related data can never be changed. It can only be reported by the officer who's entering it, and it can't be changed later. And we apply that same principle even if an agency is collecting data locally and then going to be sending it to DOJ. Our system will run it through all these automated checks and send them back some error messages, but they will never be able to change perception-related data. We understand the importance of that and sensitivity of that, and didn't want to have any type of concern that that data could be manipulated if, trends were looking in a certain direction. That is a data set that cannot be changed once it's been reported to DOJ by an agency. And within our application, if an agency elects to allow supervisors to review, the supervisor is not able to make any edits to perception-related data. But a scenario that probably would be coming up in the supervisor review is what Nancy alluded to, that the supervisor is reviewing the record and there's narrative fields, and they come across an instance where the officer, because with their normal training or for their existing training is used to being very detailed, they may indicate, stopped subject Aaron Choi at this intersection, ran a certain vehicle plate number, and found out it was a stolen vehicle. So they're used to putting detailed information, and that's not appropriate for this system because it will ultimately become public information. So that may be an appropriate use of the supervisor review to take out an individual's name or to take out an individual's license plate number or driver's license number, something like that.
one more question. Is this a good faith, your good faith input? Or are we just depending that they're just going to do it on good faith, that they're going to input every stop? Is this based on good faith?
As essentially, yes, at DOJ, our repository will reflect the data that we have received. So at a previous board meeting, I think it was the one just prior to this, agencies were invited to give updates to the board to address how they are going to be monitoring that and ensuring their local compliance. Because at this point in time, we'll know what's reported into the system, but there needs to be some local checks in place to make sure everything's getting into the system that should.
Just a follow-up question, so I didn't catch this. I know a number of agencies are using their own database, and those two, the perception data can't be changed as well.
It varies agency by agency, and I can't remember if we captured this in detail. If not, we can certainly confirm this and share the information. I know there's some local systems that don't allow anyone other than the officer to make changes. So if a supervisor reviews it and has a question, it has to go back to the officer, and only the officer can change it. Some completely lock it, and it can't be changed. So it is a little bit of variance between the agencies. But if we haven't already shared that information, we can definitely make it available, where each agency has provided a description of what they're doing locally and what can and can't be changed.
That would be great.
Okay, any additional comments there? Go ahead.
Yeah, so looking at the draft outline, this is very helpful, thank you, and it's so nice to see so far, so early in the year. So I can imagine that section 3E and 3F will be the prime time section of this, right?
Yes.
And so, am I to assume that the weight of each of these numbers and bullets is not necessarily equal, right? And that
No,
that
it's
would
not.
be.
It's just because E and F, we are still determining exactly
Yeah,
what
yeah,
goes into
okay,
those.
all right. So I think the flow of the draft outline makes sense, and I think this data analysis, because it's gonna be so pivotal, maybe there will be a way when we get to the formatting of this report to offset visually that information. Maybe it's just a different color background paper or something,
Yeah.
just because that'll be what everybody's looking for.
Or maybe the executive summary is longer than normal and really just goes to the heart of what was found, something like that. So right at the top of the report. You can
Yeah,
see what
certainly at the top of the
lines.
report, but I think, this is gonna be very meaty and interesting.
Yeah. And I think that's why we did want it right up front, but I think that having
We
that.
frequently change the format around to emphasize certain aspects, so we fully anticipate doing that again.
So I mean, we can continue. There are just a couple other things on the outline that I would want to emphasize to the board and make sure that we are all on the same page of. These are things that we've discussed, not obviously confirmed. This is just, these are for proposal and for discussion. But again, as Nancy said, it's required. We're gonna, again, have the civilian complaint data analyzed. I also would like to point out, I hope you guys all read the op-ed that was produced by Sheriff and Andrea. It was very well written, we loved it. And so we would have that civilian complaint data, and potentially, as we've talked about in the past, a model complaint form. We have some drafts of that, but at the end of last year, we decided we would hold off on that. But maybe for this year's report. And then for the training, I wanted to point out something in particular that we've talked about with Erin's team of creating, Erin's team and all of CGIS has been very dedicated to training all of the agencies on how to collect this data to ensure exactly that it's being collected appropriately and that the data integrity can be ensured. But we've thought about creating a post-certified training on this data collection that is based on the DOJ training that's already in place, but making it post-certified. And so that section could be included here of what exactly goes into the training, and to show that a lot of this training is standardized across agencies. And so that's one thing I did want to note of then also, we would continue with the work for the calls for service and bias by proxy subcommittee. It's our newest subcommittee, so that subcommittee last year discussed, as Angela notes, that we didn't include the best practice guides for the calls for service subcommittee last year because we were still doing our literature review, getting our grounds, so potentially including some of that this year to bring it up to speed with the other subcommittees. And then, obviously, there would be a large appendix for this report that would maybe need to be online or a link to it, because I think it's going to be fairly lengthy with the analytical background.
Very good. Any questions or comments on the additional information provided?
Just a question on that, and I'm sorry, this is the first I guess I had focused on the idea of having a post-certified training on how to complete the data submission. And I guess my question, and maybe it's a question for that committee, is that the most important use of post time? In other words, having a post-certified training on how to fill out the form, does that take away from time that could be spent on the actual substance and approaches around profiling and bias?
That could be, I think that, I can let the sheriff talk, but the idea behind it was to make sure that the data collection is standardized, that getting at that, but.
No, I understand the purpose. I'm not against it, but I would just hate to have it take away from time people could spend in post on sort of the meat of the matter as opposed to filling out a form.
Typically with something like this, where it's just to engage in exactly how the process works, it's an online portal that, when the deputy officer's on shift, they can simply log into the post portal and go through the training on their own time, just so it's just a consistent, and if a supervisor needs to refer to something to make sure that they're following the process. So I don't envision that this would be something that Post would have to push out to all the agencies and send a representative and get very time intensive. It would be more of just something that agencies can access and have kind of a train-the-trainer on a shift briefing, et cetera.
So, so this is actually something that CJIS and Civil Rights Section have discussed, because we have been doing these trainings for the first and second wave law enforcement agencies. We've developed a PowerPoint presentation. We've done several of these, and we saw this just as a way through DOJ we can get that training certified by Post. So Post doesn't really have to do anything, any work, because the work has already been done through DOJ. The hope is that that training, by having it certified by Post, more law enforcement agencies will be willing to utilize that training because they'll be able to get credit for it. And that's all that piece is.
Well, probably a good time to go out to public comment again. And so we'll do that now. If anyone has any comment on the latest discussions, please come forward and offer your comments. Any public comment? No? Then let's move on to item number 9, discussion and approval of the next steps. I know some of it might be a little bit repetitive on things that we've already discussed. I believe the next meeting is September 18th. Is that correct? Anybody know?
Sorry, I was just noting Timothy, you're here.
Right,
So we
yeah.
can always come up, but the next meeting, you're saying?
Yeah, just the date on the next meeting is,
It's going to be in September. September, we haven't publicly noticed it, but around September 18th, I believe is what it was. And we will have subcommittee meetings in the meantime. I think that was proposed for early June. I know that everyone's summer schedules are very busy, so we want to make sure that we kind of hit that before everyone goes on summer vacation.
Chair over there? Is there a chair back?
So, yeah.
is there additional information that DOJ needs from us other than what we've already discussed today to move forward into the subcommittee meetings?
I don't think so. I think that talking and making sure that we're all on board. So the proposed work of each subcommittee is like in the italics here on the outlines, and so I think it helps set us up for more productive subcommittee meetings if we're all on the same page for what our work is, so we don't have to spend our first subcommittee meeting discussing what we want to do, rather like diving further into it. And if you have any suggestions for what we would like prepared for each of these different smaller subcommittee groups to discuss prior, please let me know. I think that would be, we're just trying to make sure that we're set up for the most productive meetings as soon as possible. And I think
I would just ask that as we roll into this subcommittee meeting this year, I can't keep track of which subcommittee I'm on half the time. I know we have some new members, and so
Yes.
for when we go into those meetings, if all of the names of those committee members could be listed for each of the subcommittees.
I
Half the
think,
time, and I can't remember if I'm a co-chair or not a co-chair. So I don't know if anybody else is having that retention problem like I am, but that could be super helpful.
and also we can readdress if you all want to maybe change your subcommittee, if, things like that, and especially given that we've combined the two stop data and evidence-based research subcommittees. I'll send out a reminder to everyone and say, do you want to remain?
And I'm not sure if you all are aware, but Mariana Marroquin has had to step down from the board, so there is room for movement within subcommittees. So this is a good and exciting time to kind of look at what aspects you want to focus on for the next year.
Yeah, perhaps it would be helpful if you sent out a master email, because
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't know what. A master email to everyone that's like, here's who we have right now, who's on which committee, and then we can, knowing what we're supposed to be on or have been on, then we can adjust if we want.
And maybe just a list of who's on the board
Yes.
now. Feels like a little bit.
And will the
survivor.
Will the research center have, let's call it committee-specific data in time for these meetings?
So I'm not entirely sure. I'll kick that to Kevin.
Committee-specific data, just like numbers, what?
Well, there's, so for instance, I think there's a civilian complaints subcommittee. There was a committee that was looking at school-based arrests and stops and whatnot. So I guess I'm asking, when will there be any data? And in other words, if I'm on committee and we're just having another general conversation, I'd like to have that committee meeting when we actually have some data to talk about.
So it'll depend on the timing of the meeting. So say, for example, the civilian complaint data isn't finalized until, I believe, July. So
not have that committee meeting.
So prior to that point, we won't have those statistics to share with anyone at the meeting. We can still talk about other things regarding, I believe that there's a model complaint form, so that's not to say that there's not things that we could meet and discuss if we wanted to have two in between now and then for that committee. And also, we'll be working on the actual stop data, which is separate from the civilian complaint data, moving forward, picking up with that here shortly. And so we should hopefully, assuming that, I'm not exactly sure when we're thinking about for the first round of subcommittees.
I think it was June, but that is a good point about some of that data. So I can send a follow-up along with the master email follow-up of this is the subcommittee membership. Once that kind of resolves out and people have switched around, determined which subcommittees they want to serve on this year, I'll send out specific subcommittee emails that ask when it would be best to meet and note things like when we would have, for example, civilian complaint data. Not sure about for the mixed stop data subcommittee, what kind of information, like when that would be optimal to hold that subcommittee, but we can discuss, and I think.
Well, my
it's a
suggestion
good
would be that
opportunity
you
to
push
reset.
the subcommittee meetings until we have real meat. I think, it's part of the deal that we inherited with the timing of this thing, but, we're coming up on 3 years, and I think we're beginning to see some fatigue among board members in terms of attendance and of the public, and I think now we have data coming, and that's the big exciting moment, and so let's not have more meetings absent data. Let's coordinate the meetings with the research center so that they can be informed by finally some real data.
If I could chime in on that. So I know that the data is definitely big and important, but we do have other obligations as a board other than reviewing the data. And so at least for the committees that aren't data driven, like the policy committee, even the complaint committee, right? That's all information that's coming in on an annual basis. So I think it will be important for those committees to convene and get started so that we have as much done as we can do before we get to the data. That would be helpful.
Yeah, and I think that would help us get to a fuller draft earlier in the year, also doing that work up front. You know, in the past, we've had subcommittee meetings, you know, all the subcommittees meet within like a 2 or 3 week period. There's an option here that we could have some subcommittees meet earlier than others. Something that can be discussed. It's not required that they all need to be in one chunk like that. It's just been how we've been doing it. But we're flexible as the board grows.
And we're mindful that scheduling over the summer can be challenging, so that was why we wanted to have this meeting now and maybe get some meetings under our belt before the summer months really kick into high gear.
As a co-chair of the Stop Data Committee, and maybe no longer a co-chair now that you combined them, I think it's important that we meet even absent data from DOJ, so I'd just like to ask that we find time to get together.
And we can also discuss some, like, the subcommittee meetings are generally, what, 2 hours-ish?
Usually a little less.
Less than 2 hours or 2
We
hours?
budget out 2 hours with the hope that we can get you some time back.
Right, and so there's going to be a lot to discuss specifically for the Stop Data Subcommittee and now Evidence-Based Research and Stop Data Subcommittee. And so, you know, having multiple, maybe we can discuss some of that early on, what we have preliminarily, or the preliminary results, and then we can talk about some more of the results from analysis that we don't get to for a couple months from now at a later meeting, potentially, assuming that people can fit multiple meetings in their schedule.
Maybe it's the new Evidence-Based Stop Data Committee, I'm not sure, but just thinking.
Okay, whatever it's going to be called now.
We'll float some new
We'll float
names
some
for
new
you.
names.
Okay, well, I think we've reached the end of our agenda. Is that right? So thank you to the Department of Justice. Thank you to the Research Center for your report. Thank you to the members of the public who were quiet today, and to my fellow board members who traveled up for this, or down, or sideways for this meeting. We've done great work, and you know, we've come a long way, right? April 1st was a milestone for the state and for this advisory board. And we look forward to being able to analyze the data and building on all of the work that we've done together with the community, with law enforcement, with academia and other stakeholders, right? This is a joint effort, and we all need to continue to be a part of the process so that we can build for a better future. Thank you so much. With that, we adjourn this meeting.
Thank you.